For weeks, the public conversation stayed locked onto a single sequence of images: the explosions in the night sky, the sudden seizure of power, the spectacle of a sitting president dragged into custody, the endless panels arguing about oil fields, indictments, and whether the operation should be called an arrest or an invasion. That phase is past. What matters now is not the shock itself, but what followed after the cameras moved on. The real story begins once the drama fades, because that is where consequences take shape. Venezuela is no longer just a breaking news event. It has become a reference point, a live example of how power is exercised and how it is perceived. It is being studied quietly by governments across Latin America, by diplomats in Beijing, by analysts in Europe, and by countries that have learned to read signals rather than statements. What they are evaluating is not Maduro as an individual, but the method used against him and what that method implies for everyone else. What many commentators fail to notice is that the operation produced an outcome Washington did not intend. It handed China a powerful narrative advantage. While the United States justified airstrikes and extraterritorial arrests, China spoke the language of sovereignty, dialogue, and restraint. Venezuela was not the crisis itself, it was a rehearsal, and the audience was global. What changed this week is not simply who controls Caracas, but how influence now works. The operation revealed a deeper shift in American strategy, one that relies less on persuasion and more on compulsion. It also revealed how quickly that approach erodes credibility when viewed from outside the United States. The first transformation was procedural. By moving the center of gravity from diplomacy to federal courts in New York, the United States pulled a foreign power struggle into its domestic legal system. Charges, indictments, and asset seizures now define the framework for what happens next. That may feel orderly inside the United States, but internationally it looks like jurisdictional overreach, where American law is treated as global law by default. More important than the courtroom mechanics was the regional response. This was not a scatter of isolated condemnations. It was coordinated. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay issued a joint statement, not parallel reactions, but a single unified position. That distinction matters. It signals that Latin American governments are beginning to see these operations not as exceptions, but as patterns that could one day involve them. At the United Nations, the issue escalated further. Accusations were no longer limited to political criticism. They became legal. Multiple countries argued that the United States had violated the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force against sovereign states. Investigative bodies acknowledged alleged abuses by Venezuela's government, but emphasized that those allegations do not justify military intervention without international authorization. The debate shifted from whether the operation fit American law to whether international law has any force at all when a major power decides to bypass it. That question is far larger than Venezuela. It cuts to the core of the post-war system. If rules apply selectively, then they cease to function as rules. They become preferences enforced by power. This brings us to the structural change in how American influence is now applied. For much of the last half-century, U.S. leadership rested on alliances, institutions, and economic integration. Countries accepted American primacy because it came bundled with access, stability, and predictable norms. That foundation is weakening. In its place is a model built on sanctions, financial control, legal pressure, and the implicit threat of force. Today, a majority of low-income countries live under some form of U.S. financial sanction. The United States deploys economic penalties at a scale unmatched by any other actor. Access to dollar-based systems is conditional. Attempts to bypass them are punished through secondary sanctions. Venezuela demonstrates what happens when those tools fail. Pressure escalates. From Washington, this may look like enforcement. From the outside, it looks like coercion, and coercion changes calculations. If integration with American systems means exposure to sudden punishment when priorities change, countries begin searching for alternatives. That is the contradiction at the heart of current U.S. strategy. The harder it pushes to preserve dominance through force and financial leverage, the more incentive others have to reduce their dependence on American-controlled systems. This is where China enters the picture, not through confrontation, but through positioning. Beijing did not intervene militarily. It did not issue threats. It simply framed itself as the defender of sovereignty and legal process. It condemned the operation as a violation of international norms and called for dialogue. In Latin America, that message resonated not because China is viewed as virtuous, but because it appeared predictable. Across the region, governments compared experiences. China builds ports, roads, and power plants. The United States applies sanctions, issues ultimatums, and now demonstrates willingness to use force. China offers loans and trade agreements with clear, long-term terms. The United States offers access paired with conditions that can shift overnight with elections or political moods. Statements from regional leaders reflected this recalibration. Brazil described the operation as a dangerous precedent. Colombia emphasized peaceful resolution. Mexico pointed directly to violations of the UN Charter. These were not marginal voices. They were signaling a loss of confidence in American restraint. The unintended result is that Washington's attempt to project strength ended up advertising China as an alternative partner. Not a benevolent one, but a stable one. Every country watching understands the implication. If this can be done to Venezuela, it can be done to others too. This is the beginning of a broader reassessment in the hemisphere. For decades, alignment with the United States was the default assumption. That assumption is now under review. Governments are weighing predictable economic engagement against unpredictable political pressure. For many, the appeal of China is not ideological. It is transactional and, above all, consistent. This shift does not happen overnight, but once trust erodes, it is difficult to restore. Venezuela marks a point where skepticism became collective rather than individual, and that collective shift is what gives the episode its lasting significance. The recalculation underway in Latin America becomes even clearer when you zoom out and look at the pattern rather than the single case. Venezuela did not emerge in a vacuum. It sits alongside years of escalating pressure applied to multiple governments in the region. Colombia has faced threats tied to migration policy. Mexico has been pressured on trade, border enforcement, and industrial policy. Cuba remains under permanent sanction. Panama has been warned over control of the canal. For years, much of this sounded rhetorical, aggressive language designed for domestic audiences. Venezuela changed that perception. It demonstrated that escalation is not theoretical. Once that line is crossed, governments adapt their behavior, not emotionally, but strategically. The question shifts from, do we agree with Washington, to what is the cost if we don't? And once that question is asked, dependence becomes a liability. That is why diversification accelerates. That is why alternatives gain appeal. China's model fits neatly into this moment. It does not require ideological alignment. It does not demand public loyalty. It does not tie economic engagement to foreign policy votes. Its agreements are often opaque and imperfect, but they are stable. For governments that have experienced sudden sanctions or policy reversals from the United States, stability itself becomes a form of security. This is not about admiration for Beijing. Many countries distrust China deeply, but distrust is manageable when behavior is predictable. Uncertainty is harder to hedge, And right now, American power appears increasingly volatile, shaped by internal politics, executive authority, and security institutions that operate with limited transparency. Energy sits at the center of this entire equation. Venezuela's oil reserves are not important because of current output. They matter because of potential and precedent. Sitting atop the largest proven reserves on the planet, Venezuela represents a long-term prize in an energy system already under strain. Control over that supply is not just about barrels per day. It is about currency, pricing, and leverage. For decades, oil has been priced primarily in dollars. That arrangement creates constant global demand for U.S. currency. It underwrites American borrowing, supports deficit spending, and anchors financial influence. But cracks have been forming for years. Energy trades settled in local currencies are becoming more common. Major producers are experimenting with alternatives. Venezuela, under sanctions, accelerated that trend by selling oil to China in yuan through non-dollar payment systems. From Washington's perspective, that is a strategic threat, not because of immediate volume, but because of demonstration. If a sanctioned state can survive while bypassing the dollar, others may try. And once that behavior spreads, the foundation of dollar dominance weakens incrementally, then suddenly, removing the Venezuelan government serves multiple objectives. It brings future production back under structures friendly to dollar-based trade. It blocks China from securing a privileged energy relationship. It reinforces the message that deviation carries consequences, but it also sends another message, one Washington may not fully appreciate. To energy producers watching from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, the lesson is not reassurance, it is caution. China may negotiate hard, but it does not bomb capitals or remove leaders. The United States, in this case, did. That perception matters more than official explanations. This creates a paradox. Actions taken to preserve long-term monetary dominance may accelerate the search for alternatives. The more aggressively the system is defended, the more attractive exit options become. Venezuela could end up remembered not as a victory for dollar control, but as a catalyst for its gradual erosion. The damage extends beyond economics into the legal and institutional realm. The United Nations system is built on a fragile premise that even the most powerful states will at least pretend to follow shared rules. The prohibition on unilateral force is not symbolic, it is foundational. When it is ignored without consequence, the credibility of the entire system weakens. In this case, the response to legal criticism was dismissive. The implication was clear. Strategic objectives override international constraints. That posture mirrors exactly the behavior the United States condemns when practiced by others. The result is not just accusations of hypocrisy, but the collapse of normative authority. If international law cannot restrain Washington, it cannot logically restrain Moscow or Beijing either. Arguments about territorial integrity and sovereignty lose force when selectively applied. Smaller states notice this immediately. They understand that rules without enforcement are promises without meaning. This is not unprecedented in U.S. history. Washington supported a failed coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002 and pursued regime change in Venezuela through sanctions and political pressure for years. What distinguishes the current moment is the directness. Airstrikes on a capital, the forcible removal of a head of state. These are escalatory steps that redraw boundaries. Precedents matter in international politics. Once established, they are invoked again and again. If one great power normalizes this behavior, others will cite it when pursuing their own objectives. The erosion of restraint is cumulative. There is also an internal dynamic often overlooked. Decisions of this magnitude are increasingly detached from broad democratic consent. Congressional oversight has weakened. Emergency authorities and executive power have expanded. Sensitive operations are briefed after the fact, not debated beforehand. This reflects institutional momentum more than public demand. Defense budgets grow regardless of outcomes. Intelligence agencies operate with limited scrutiny. Contractors profit from instability. The system incentivizes action, not patience. President Eisenhower warned of this dynamic decades ago, cautioning that a permanent arms industry would exert influence over policy itself. That warning feels less historical and more descriptive today. The machinery moves forward even as trust erodes behind it. The cost of that momentum is paid quietly, in alliances strained by unpredictability, in partners hedging their bets, in diminished soft power that no military budget can replace. These losses do not show up on balance sheets, but they shape the strategic environment for years. For Americans, especially those approaching retirement, these shifts are not abstract. Energy markets respond to instability. Dollar strength depends on confidence as much as policy. If global demand for dollars weakens, borrowing costs rise. Bond values fall. Retirement portfolios feel the pressure. Beyond finances lies something harder to quantify. Many older Americans grew up believing the United States stood for law, restraint, and leadership by example. Watching those principles compromised produces a deeper unease. National identity is tied to perception abroad as much as comfort at home. The question now facing policymakers is not whether the operation succeeded tactically, but what it signals strategically. Has the United States entered an era where coercion replaces persuasion as the default tool, where threats substitute for alliances, where legitimacy is sacrificed for speed? If so, the response from the rest of the world is predictable. Countries will hedge. They will diversify trade. They will experiment with alternative systems. They will seek partners who offer stability rather than dominance. China benefits from this environment without having to create it. It expands influence by filling gaps left by American pressure. It does not need to convince countries it is virtuous. It only needs to appear reliable. This is the shift that Venezuela represents. Not the fall of one government, but the acceleration of a global realignment already underway. The final consequences will not be measured in headlines, but in choices made quietly, over time, by states that no longer assume American leadership is benign or permanent. And that brings us to the final reckoning, not of legality or tactics, but of legacy. What this moment will ultimately be remembered for is not who was arrested, but what was lost in the process. What was lost is difficult to recover once it slips away. Credibility does not vanish in a single strike, but it erodes through accumulation. Venezuela added weight to a scale that was already tilting. Long before this operation, many countries sensed that the rules-based order was becoming conditional. This moment confirmed it. The idea that power would be restrained by law gave way to the reality that law bends to power when stakes are high enough. History tends to compress events. Years from now, Venezuela will not be remembered primarily for the courtroom battles or the immediate political fallout. It will be remembered as a signal, a moment when uncertainty hardened into belief, a moment when Latin America stopped assuming that American power would be exercised with restraint even toward its neighbors. The operation may still deliver short-term outcomes Washington desires. New leadership structures could emerge. Oil production may eventually recover. Energy markets might stabilize for a time. But strategy is not measured only in immediate gains. It is measured in reactions. And the reactions unfolding now suggest that the cost of this action will compound. Alliances function on trust, not fear. Fear produces compliance, but only temporarily. Trust produces cooperation that survives leadership changes and crises. The United States once understood this distinction instinctively. Its greatest strength was not its military reach, but its ability to persuade others that its leadership served a broader interest. That belief is now under strain. As countries reassess, they are not rushing to embrace China wholesale. They are doing something more subtle. They are balancing. They are ensuring that no single partner holds overwhelming leverage over them. They are building redundancy into their economic and diplomatic relationships. That process weakens American influence, even if no formal break ever occurs. China's advantage in this environment is structural. It does not need to threaten to gain access. It does not need to enforce compliance through sanctions. It positions itself as an option that becomes more attractive each time American power is exercised abruptly. This does not mean China is replacing the United States as a global leader. It means the world is becoming more fragmented, more multipolar, and less responsive to pressure from any single center. In that world, dominance is harder to maintain, and legitimacy becomes more valuable than raw power. The irony is that the United States still possesses immense assets. Its economy remains central. Its technology shapes global standards. Its culture continues to influence societies worldwide. But these advantages rely on consent as much as capability. When consent erodes, influence becomes expensive to sustain. The institutional damage may prove the most enduring. International law survives only when major powers uphold it, even when inconvenient. Once violations become normalized, appeals to law sound hollow. Smaller states internalize this lesson quickly. They stop expecting protection from norms and start seeking security through alignment or deterrence. That dynamic increases instability. When rules weaken, arms races accelerate. When trust fades, miscalculation becomes more likely. The very outcomes military interventions claim to prevent become harder to avoid. Inside the United States, these consequences are often invisible. News cycles move on, attention shifts, but abroad memories are longer. Diplomatic decisions are shaped by precedent more than rhetoric. Venezuela will sit quietly in briefing books and strategic assessments as an example of what American power now looks like when challenged. For Americans evaluating their country's role in the world, this creates a difficult tension. Strength and restraint are not opposites. Historically, the most durable power systems balanced both. When restraint disappears, strength begins to undermine itself. There is still space to adjust course. Influence loss can sometimes be regained, but only through consistency and humility. Rebuilding trust requires demonstrating that power will not be used arbitrarily, that rules matter even when enforcement is inconvenient, and that partnership is more than compliance. Whether that recalibration happens is uncertain. The incentives inside the system currently reward speed, decisiveness, and displays of force. The rewards for patience and diplomacy are harder to quantify and slower to appear. The Venezuela operation will fade from public memory as all events do, but its imprint on global perceptions will linger. Countries will continue to ask quieter questions. What happens if we disagree? How secure is our sovereignty? How diversified are our options? Those questions reshape behavior long before they reshape headlines. They influence trade routes, currency choices, military cooperation, and diplomatic alignments. They determine who is trusted in moments of crisis. In that sense, the true outcome of Venezuela is still unfolding. It is unfolding in negotiations that choose alternative currencies, in infrastructure contracts signed without American firms, in regional statements that emphasize autonomy rather than alignment. Power in the 21st century is not only about the ability to act, it is about the ability to be believed. Once belief falters, even overwhelming capability delivers diminishing returns. The final verdict will not be written by courts or commentators. It will be written by patterns of behavior over the next decade. If the United States continues down a path where coercion replaces persuasion, the world will adapt by building systems designed to withstand that pressure. History rarely announces turning points clearly. They are recognized in retrospect once trajectories become obvious. Venezuela may come to be seen as one of those points. Not because of what happened in a single operation, but because of what it revealed about a changing approach to power. When future analysts look back, they may conclude that this was the moment when American leadership began to look less like stewardship and more like enforcement. And in a world with alternatives, enforcement alone is rarely enough to sustain influence. What remains now is choice. The choice between doubling down on pressure or rediscovering the value of restraint, between demanding alignment or earning it, between relying on fear or rebuilding trust. The world is already responding, quietly, methodically, and with a long memory.